Hi, I'm Greg Ness with Infoblox, and FiRe's put together a great panel on is the network ready for cloud computing? And think about this as kind of a two-part panel. The first part is a little bit of a peek behind the curtains of the cloud computing story and dealing with some of the issues primarily around the network. And the second part is a more general discussion about the impact of if we can address these problems and issues, how the economy, jobs, businesses can be transformed. So to kind of set the stage, if we think back to the early days of telephony, the phone companies had a lot of manual processes. And as those phone networks grew and got to be certain sizes, as the incidence of change increased, they replaced those manual processes with automation. So now the enterprise networks are getting larger and larger. And if I could share a slide here, if I just hit the clicker here, what this is a result of a survey from Computer World a few years ago. And if I was to summarize the point is, as networks get larger, more complicated, the cost to manage each individual endpoint increases. So as we think about this from a context of cloud and larger service provider networks, larger and larger data centers, more power consumption, the point being that large enterprises, large consolidated data centers are actually at a disadvantage as long as they rely on manual processes. So this increase is substantial, and then obviously as you add units, it goes up higher. Kind of the double whammy to this was mentioned in the press just a couple weeks ago by Cisco's CTO, Padme Warrior. Glenn, I think you know Padme, right?
I'm familiar with her.
That there will be 1 trillion devices connected to the network by 2013. So now we have a case of more and more devices, more and more endpoints, higher costs per, and with a prediction of a deluge. And I really don't think that Padme was counting VMs either, and that's another question. So as we kind of look at all of the buzz about cloud computing, definitions of cloud, what we really want to know is how is this all going to work with the network? Are we indeed going to have the dumb pipes and the consolidation, kind of a return to the mainframe era, or is the network going to evolve? So FiRe's basically brought together a panel of experts in networking and cloud, and let me introduce them. And just raise your hand as I call out your name. Richard McDougall, Chief Cloud Architect, App Architect, VMware. Yousef Khalidi, Distinguished Engineer, Windows Azure. Glenn Dasmalchi, Tech Chief of Staff, Office of CTO, Cisco. Mark Thiele, VP of Data Center Strategy, ServiceMesh. And Lou Tucker, former CTO Cloud at Sun Microsystems. So let me just ask you guys, as we've talked about these issues, right? More endpoints, more complexity, rising costs, not declining costs, a diseconomy of scale. Given the problems, what is it going to take to make cloud a success from a standpoint of the network?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that, right? Okay. So I think that the first thing to realize is that there are cloud offerings that exist today, right? So people are out there with offerings, and I guess the engineering answer to your question is, it all depends on what kind of cloud you're actually trying to offer. But in general, one way to view a cloud behind the curtain, just like we have a lot of equipment here, is there is a lot of infrastructure that needs to be managed. And you can think of cloud as a set of new architectures that has to scale, right? And has to scale with the right enterprise class capabilities. So that implies quite a bit about the feature set and the roadmap that you need from the network. So if you think about some of the architectures as being multi-tenant, you have to make sure that the network can support the isolation, which in turn leads to the kind of multi-tenancy you need. But the key point about this, back to your point, Greg, is once you have this feature set, once you have the roadmap that meets the scale demands of the clouds moving forward, you have to automate that feature set, and you have to automate those functions. And that's really what's missing today, because in today's enterprise environments, you can set things up statically and you can get by. But that's not going to be the case, and that solution's not going to work for cloud.
Automate the network itself.
Exactly.
And also, if I might jump in there, I think what we're also seeing is sort of a split, though, between, we have a new set of these companies called cloud providers. If you look at Amazon, Windows Azure, other companies that are going out and providing now cloud computing through the internet, where you can, for as low as like 10 cents an hour, essentially have your own virtual machine. they can achieve that only through that kind of automation. However, we're seeing in businesses, traditional IT data centers, they're lagging further and further behind, and their costs are rising. So the economics of it are actually driving now businesses to take a look at what's happening in these web companies. The architectures that are being designed for behind Facebook, MySpace, any of these things are designed fundamentally differently than we've had in traditional enterprise architectures. So they are placing different demands on the network for sure. But I think that their solution has been through automation, through virtualization, some of these more technical areas that we will probably get into. But that's what's making a real change, I think. And that we're seeing then the businesses now looking at the web companies going, how do I do that? How do I get to be Google scale? How can a small startup, 3 guys in a garage, now compete with that? And in cloud computing, you actually have, because I think as Ray mentioned, it's a new delivery model of computing, so you can pay for only what you need, and you can actually rapidly grow as your business grows. So that's what I think is going to create the real pressures on the network then to respond.
So could I Twitter and change my Oracle account and update it with Twitter? Is that what we're going to?
I'm sure there will be an app for that.
Richard, I think you had it.
I want to follow up on that comment about multi-tenant, because I think that's the key thing, and there pretty much could be a pretty big shift in the way that networks are managed now. I think if you look at the traditional networks, they're viewed as a pretty big monolith, and we manage the whole thing as an entity. And if we look at what's going on with cloud, the premise of multi-tenant means that there's the people that run the plant, the infrastructure, the cables, and that problem stays somewhat similar. But now every tenant of the cloud expects to do network management and feature sets of their piece of the network. So I think we're going to see an evolution of the set of network functionality being separated. We're going to see very high speed, low cost, switching to the virtual curb technology. And then we're going to see a set of network management technologies that do routing, switching, management that are aimed at the tenant and the consumer of their little piece of the cloud. And I think there's a whole set of new opportunities and technologies that are going to sort of move in to fill that space. That's how I think we're going to scale management, because then everyone that's a tenant can to manage their piece of the virtual cloud.
I do want to add one thing. We do also need more malleable networks, more flexible networks. It's one thing to automate them, which is a given. We have to automate them. But today's applications assume certain topologies. In a classical way, one designs a network for an application. But cloud computing is about utility computing, where you have a large-scale infrastructure that has to meet the demands of many, many applications, your multi-tenant comment, for example. And as such, we need to, as providers of cloud computing, have network infrastructure that's malleable, that we can change in terms of bandwidth, connectivity, security, access policies to meet the needs of the applications. And that malleability at the moment is not present in the technology we have at hand.
And so that's a good segue. So as we start talking about virtualization and the spread, and I've talked to many enterprises that say in these large-scale environments, virtualization only works to about 25 to 30% of the data center, because we start running into virtual network VLAN capacity issues, inflexibility, and then the networking teams don't have visibility into those IP endpoints and assets, which is pretty troublesome. So just kind of from that standpoint, maybe you can take us through like some of the problem areas that are both technology opportunities as well as investment opportunities in terms of how these problems are going to be addressed.
Well, one place to start is that we have to remember what our network that we have today was originally designed for. And that goes back into the early days of the ARPANET. It was never envisioned to be running at the scale that it is today. So we, as consumers, might be upset that my iPhone doesn't work in San Francisco or New York or most of the major cities anymore because of wireless bandwidth. But in fact, even things such as IP addresses, until we get to IPv6, things such as you said, the number of tags that you can have to make your own private network. We're building now data centers at a scale never before done. So that all of a sudden, all of the assumptions made in the originally designed a lot of networking technologies are sort of out of the window. Because what we're trying to do, as we mentioned like last night, everything is about scale. So as we're getting the cost economies at this very large scale, however, that's creating these great new pressures on sort of very, very old networking technology. I think that a number of us are actually looking at like the next generation of the infrastructure 2.0. What happens to TCP/IP? What happens to our addressing and naming schemes? And we're trying to live with that, and it's been remarkable that we've been able to extend it as much as we have today. But there is a question as to what now needs to be changed as we get to these very large, multi-tenant, cloud provider environments.
So I would just say that one of the key differences in the in the world of the network today from the world of just a few years ago is that the vast majority of transport that most of us cared about in supplying service to our customers was moving data. And a key distinction between that market and today's market is that now we're moving condition data or state data, as was talked about with Mark and Ray earlier. And that's a very different environment to take care of on the network. The way as was talked about earlier, the complexity of today's network from a manual standpoint makes that very prohibitive, both in a cost and an overhead standpoint for the people supporting that environment. But in order for cloud to really realize its opportunity from a consumer use standpoint, from a business growth standpoint, et cetera, that state and that opportunity from an access point standpoint needs to be extremely portable, needs to be adaptable, needs to be able to be sized appropriately based on the local network or the local access requirements or the size of the company, et cetera. And when I say portable, I don't just mean from your phone back to a data center, but I mean from data center to data center, from a corporate enterprise's data center to another data center. And that raises distinct challenges from a network perspective. But I think most of us here would agree that it also potentially, if we survive this challenge, cloud potentially offers the opportunity of a growth market from an enterprise standpoint and from a consumer standpoint, small business standpoint, that we haven't seen since 1995 and the internet. The ability to democratize IT and deliver IT in bite-sized chunks, in chunks that people can afford to pay for, in the amount, the type, and the quantity that they need, where they need it, when they need it, will, I think most of us believe, dramatically change how people use IT. And that in and of itself will be a business generator.
Well, let me kind of summarize what we've said so far. Number one, the network right now is an impediment to the spread of virtualization and many of the models of cloud computing as we see today. It needs to be automated. And the potential is, once the network is automated, for lots of the new business models, right? And especially at the SMB mom and pop layer where they didn't have access to some of the enterprise tools, productivity tools. So if you classified, let's say, early 2000, late 90s as that kind of e-commerce capital boom, maybe there's this C-commerce idea, which is how cloud actually, instead of giving you the ability that e-commerce did to hang a shingle on the internet and collect eyeballs and monetize them, you now have a C-commerce model, which is you use cloud to basically transform the productivity of your small business. And again, a kind of renaissance in that category around the world, in the same way that micropayments helped India. So, so if we tackle this problem with network, it sounds like things are pretty interesting. If you want to extend on that, like what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a set of quality of service issues that need to be addressed in a better way. So the premise of cloud computing is to move some of the services out. And if you put applications out on the other side of the network, then you're exposing all of your users now to the network properties and latencies. So what we really want to be able to see is sort of top-down application-driven quality of service, where the network can really understand what the application is trying to do, and then modulate its network access based on that quality of service. One of the best cases of this you've seen with sort of a cloud-based app is something like Netflix. They stream media from many different sources. When you watch something and they're streaming from several sources, they're monitoring the QoS of every one of those, and they're picking a different network path depending on the quality of service. And so applications are going to need to be smarter. The infrastructure of the applications right and the applications themselves need to be smarter about how to understand QoS and then walk around the network and control the network to achieve that level of quality of service.
If I may add to Richard's point, I do believe applications have to meet the cloud halfway, in that we can invest quite a bit in networking throughout the stack, from the level 2, level 3, all the way up. But applications have to also understand that the network is different. It's about delivery of services. And laws of physics are laws of physics, so you have to deliver the service over a network, perhaps remotely. So latency cannot be just not thought of, if you will. Chatty protocols have to become less chatty. Caching, synchronization of data is important. So we do need to invest more in the network. Again, as I mentioned, multiple levels within the data center, within the connectivity, the under last mile. But we also need to invest in the other direction in the application set, in the services that understand that now it's a fact of life that you no longer have a firewall. You are on the internet.
So it's kind of interesting that when, I would say for the first year or so of you read the trade publications in IT about cloud computing, there's very rarely ever been a mention of the network. And I was reading a blog the other day from Networld Interop, and they were talking about how the network needs to evolve, and there was a panel there. And none of the network vendors mentioned cloud. And to me, this seems to be, based on what you guys are saying, a pretty big gap. Is the network strategic to IT again because of the promise of virtualization in cloud?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely strategic. I think one of the reasons you don't hear a lot about the network is when you think about cloud services from a user point of view, yeah, users appreciate that they have connectivity using, whatever last mile device they happen to be using. But what's behind the scenes is not necessarily visible to them. But I think several of us know what's going on behind the scenes. So I think when we talk about the role of the network, you can view cloud as the single logical entity, but somewhere there is at least one data center that's part of making that cloud a reality. And there's probably multiple data centers which are dispersed geographically. And guess what? It's a network that connects those locations together. And then there are always users, right? So there's a whole chain of networks between the multiple data center sites and the users themselves. And so the network functionality is really critical, right? And the network is changing, right? I mean, you asked some of the earlier questions, right? The network is becoming aware of some of the atomic containers that we're using in cloud these days, mostly the virtual machine, but not always the virtual machine. You talk about VLANs and VLAN limitations, but there are other isolation technologies that are being developed as well. So summary answer to your questions, yeah, it's absolutely critical.
One thing I might add, that the opportunities that now exist or that will exist because of cloud computing, I think, are tremendous, because as computer scientists, what we almost always seem to be doing is creating a new layer of abstraction and then rebuild the entire old infrastructure again at this new layer. Hopefully that it's simpler, faster, more cost-effective. And that's what we're doing again with cloud computing. So not only are we seeing virtual machines now in the cloud, we're seeing virtual networks being able to be formed there, virtual networking services there. All of this, we're taking the entire industry again, so that professional services opportunities are there for companies to go in this. New applications, as you say, are going to be designed for this new environment. And they're going to be designed quite differently, I believe. So I think that for startups right now, I think it's totally greenfield in terms of the kinds of services that are going out there. Databases in the sky, for example. I mean, who wants to run and manage their own database anymore when you could get that as a service? So if you are now building a new application, there's probably very little need for you. We shouldn't necessarily just jump to building your own database. You should think about using a database service. You should use a storage service. You should use a content delivery network. You should use all of these new services, and that's how you create these new applications going forward. So I think there's tremendous opportunities for new companies here.
And you use the term network here in the general sense.
Yes.
Beyond just the plumbing, if you will, all the way to
Exactly
a
right.
stack here.
Right.
You're mentioning one of the things, though, it's actually a major stumbling block right now, which is the data and the databases. And it's sort of, you look at it, there's an evolutionary step where it's really hard to separate applications from their data right now. They're stuck to databases, they're reasonably monolithic, and they're statically placed. And so what we're seeing is a lot of interim technologies to help current enterprises move their applications to the cloud by tethering them somehow close to their data. They either have to move their data to the cloud provider, or they have to come up with some extremely low latency way of moving their application data and services between the external cloud and their enterprise in the federated case. So we're seeing the emergence of regional data centers, maybe placed close, just outside the proximity of the enterprise data centers. A lot of things like that that are going to help that federation aspect. But in the longer term, we've got to figure out how to solve the data problem. We've got to figure out how to make data distributed, replicated, consistent in a way that there's not this concept of this central pool of data, which is like holding all the applications from being mobile in the cloud. And I think we're going to see an emergence of a lot of data replication technologies which significantly change the bandwidth and latency topologies of the applications. That's going to take a while.
People often forget right now that the tremendous disparity between the size of the data set and the size of the application. So as you say, it's much easier today to actually move the application to be closer to the data than to always bring the data cross-country or whatever. And as going back to your original slide, as we start getting sensor data on board, then we have to solve the distributed data problem. There just will be no choice. We will not be able to move all the data to one central location, process it there, and then take it back out.
If you think about all the problems that have been mentioned, I mean, Yousef made some points about things like caching, et cetera, being able to mask performance over the network, et cetera. Glenn talked about the network. But I think what we've all found in the industry is that all of those things are good for solving problems that we believe are intractable. So we're willing to tell our customers, this will help you feel better about the work you're doing over the network. We know it isn't perfect, but it's better than not having caching. It's better than not doing compression on your network, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that over time, as we've seen technologies get adopted and used, ease of access, ease of use, and speed. Google has proved it, right? They've proved that they're willing to pay in millions of servers to have a 1/8 second turnaround time on their web page load speed because they see enormous drop-off in customer use whenever that latency goes up, even a quarter of a second. So as we move forward, the ability to have the network automatically move your data and your application environments where they need to be based on demand, based on use policy, based on use characteristics, in order to give people a consistent level of performance is a must, because latency is a rule of nature, right? We can fight it all we want, but until we figure out how to make networks move at faster than the speed of light, somebody trying to access an application that's stored in New York from Tokyo is going to be really unhappy. It doesn't matter what you're doing with the network in between. You can make it as good as possible, but you need to make it better. You need to make it real time. You need to be able to access it on your phone and get it done in 30 seconds, and that's transaction time and entry time and everything, and get back to what you're doing, not wait 2 minutes for the web page to load.
So coming back to the question about virtualization and scale, it actually dovetails on it really well in that I think we're now seeing that we can actually separate out the applications from the infrastructure and move these components around. And so we're looking pretty heavily at automation technologies which can actually look at the access patterns. And so instead of having this big matrix cloud of communication between everything, you can actually organize things so that the things that talk to each other are near each other. And that actually changes the characteristics on the network quite a lot when you do that.
But you actually, I mean, what you see, so I've spent some time building networks for enterprises, and what you see is that the best design networks actually reduce your load on any given link, because you're ensuring that the traffic goes the shortest possible route and doesn't duplicate routes. And this is no different, right? If we take the networks we have today and throw all of the opportunity from cloud on it that people are considering today, we would have log jams like 405 has never seen, right?
Yep.
I mean, it would be really nasty.
So sort of like pipes, I guess.
What's that?
I won't get into the internet descriptions that some people have.
Yeah, but the bottom line is we do, as Richard pointed out so clearly, that we need to be able to distribute those apps and distribute them based on use characteristics of time of day, of geolocation. I mean, how many of us know offices that are in LA and the vast majority of the workforce is in Pakistan or India or the Philippines or something?
If I may want to add one point which we haven't touched on, which is access control and policy management. By definition, we're talking about distributing stuff all over the place. And whether we like it or not, there are compliance issues, regulation issues, national boundaries, and laws that dictate how data may live where and how it can be moved. So since we're talking about the network in general, moving up the stack, we really have to look at what does it mean for me to put certain data in certain places? When can I access it? What's my identity system, my access controls, and the like? Let's go into layer 6 and 7 of the stack and so forth.
It's a Quincy question.
It's basically, and also national boundary states and so forth. And those can be a hindrance to cloud acceptance if we are not careful. So we can solve a lot of the caching issues and the physics and the application changes and the like, but we cannot ignore regulations, compliance, and laws. So we need to have technology to enable us to control who can access what and when and so forth.
So let me throw one more question to you guys. I see we have a little bit less than 5 minutes remaining. Back at Promontory, Utah, the Golden Spike was laid, and it combined the rails from, the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. And it forever changed our country. It changed the way our economics and foundation. And the Pony Express, the collection of manual processes to make things work, went out of business very, very quickly. So what happens to the networking industry and, let's say, the virtualization and cloud industry when somebody solves this problem and drills that golden spike? What kind of transformations in market values of companies? To me, I think it would justify a whole new CapEx spending cycle, right? Because now the cost of the new gear is less than the cost of the old because of the manual labor. And clearly how VMware came into this business was the same issues, not on the network side, but on the server side. So any comments to that?
Yeah, I think Ray mentioned that we're taking friction out of the system. Whenever you do that, there's some catastrophic changes for different parts of the industry. Right now, for example, if you look at when you are spinning up a virtual machine and it costs maybe 10 cents an hour, and you're putting $2 per hour of enterprise software on top of that, I think customers are going to be looking at and going, where's the value in that? When they might be able to go over and get something equivalent for open source. If they want to manage it themselves, they might be able to go to a service provider and get it for then 15 cents an hour. So I think that will be continuing to be the shift away from the old school way that we had heavy licensing fees and distribution through very complex channels to this kind of direct distribution between the content, generator, creator, and the consumer through the internet, which we can reduce all of those costs. And so I think companies that don't adapt to that change, I think, are going to be, fighting a rearguard, war all the time. So they have to be changing.
What about in the data center, for instance?
I think there's going to be a shake-up in the data center, because if you look at the trends going forward, the infrastructure costs, power, machines, like the actual host CPUs and the network, the network is starting to dominate, and the trend is that the cost of the network infrastructure is going to be the dominant cost if you map it out 4 or 5 years' time. And what you're seeing is an emergence of very low cost, like 10 gigabit Ethernet networks, and under $100 a port now, providing the fabric, the high-speed fabric for the back end. And that's actually enough to ride system software on top of it that can then provide software network services. And so I think we could see a pretty big shift here, that there's a separation between who provides those technologies and at the economics of how they're provided.
I was going to say, I agree, but I think the role of the network, if you talk about the data center, is going to be more than just speeds and feeds, right? I mean, speeds and feeds are important, but there is a rich feature set that has to do with security and multi-tenant isolation and maintaining service levels as well. If I tie it to the overall market shift that you ask about, I do agree that there's going to be this trend. The cloud is this new choice that even enterprises will have to offload or shift some of their workload. But I think essentially forever it's going to be a mix. It's going to be a hybrid. I mean, when's the last time anything in IT ever truly went away, right? I think you have a new option now, and you're blending in this new option. So things don't go away. They're just being added.
Well, I was the recipient of Mark's get off the stage hook at the last FiRe, so I see about a minute left, and so I'm trying to negotiate a nice smooth landing. And what I'll say is that we have a session at 4 o'clock this afternoon. It's a full hour, and we're all going to be there. And if you want to have any questions and discussions and talk about the issues and what it's going to take to automate networks, what are the payoffs, and how it will change the competitive landscape, let us know. We have 45 seconds. Does anyone have a really quick question? Yes, Beth.
Hi, my name is Audrey Hitchings. I'm from Deloitte, and I actually have a question that came in from the Mirror site that's being held in Brazil. And the question is, how is cloud computing supported in countries with minimum infrastructure and network? And are there ways to use wireless or satellite technologies to access the cloud?
Actually, if I can respond, World Economic Forum is actually looking at the impact on developing countries of cloud computing. And one of the things that, and I believe Deloitte is participating in that, is that we're seeing that entire countries may skip this whole step that we had where every business built their own data center. If we can actually get data centers as these multi-tenant service providers built in the developing world, they can get a tremendous advantage and leap over, as they have before, some of the technology steps that we took. And instead, they could go right towards getting all of their services out of these large service providers where they can get the scale to drive down the cost, and also get them much more connected to the backbone, basically, of our network, so that they could serve a global market from a very small place in Brazil, for example.
So thank you very much, gentlemen. We've run out of time, and thank you, guys. Hopefully, we'll see some of you at 4 o'clock.